My name is Frankie Allen. I'm 35 years old and I live in a quiet suburb of Ohio, where life feels like a constant balancing act between my demanding job and the messier, more complicated world of family. By day, I'm a financial manager at a nonprofit organization, 12 years in, and I've learned how to navigate budgets, track expenses, and make sure numbers add up without breaking a sweat. But at home, it's a different kind of ledger I'm trying to keep, one filled with debts not listed on any spreadsheet. Emotional debts, unspoken expectations, and the kind of quiet sacrifice that often goes unnoticed. I cover the rent on the house we share, $2,600 a month, split with Lauren, my younger sister. Well, Lauren supposedly contributes, but the reality is I'm footing nearly all of it. Utilities, internet, groceries, even Lauren's monthly therapy fees, those are on me too. I never once complained. I told myself it was just family helping family, and I did it to keep the peace, to avoid the kind of fights that have always simmered under the surface with Lauren and my dad, Richard. You see, we have weekly family dinners. They're polite, structured affairs where smiles are forced and the air smells faintly of steamed vegetables and cheap wine. But beneath those smiles, I can feel the tension like a low hum, waiting to rise. It's the kind of tension you learn to ignore, but it never really goes away. I try to keep things smooth, to be the rock everyone leans on. But deep down, it wears me thin. One particular morning, everything shattered in less than 5 minutes. I was in the kitchen halfway through making coffee when Lauren burst through the front door, her voice loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood. "My $9,000 diamond necklace! She took it!" she screamed, pointing directly at me. Her eyes were wild, full of accusation, her voice cracking with rage. The necklace was a family heirloom, a piece she'd barely earned the right to wear, but loved obsessively. I froze mid-pour, the coffee dribbling down the side of the mug. My heart pounded in my chest, confusion swirling with shock. "Lauren," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what you mean. I haven't," but she cut me off, her voice rising. "Don't lie. You took it from my room. I know it. You're the only one who's been in there." The front hallway seemed to shrink around me as I suddenly felt the weight of every strained smile, every ignored effort, every silent sacrifice crashing down in that moment. The accusation was a slap I hadn't been prepared for. Before I could even defend myself, the front door slammed open again and Dad appeared, face tight with judgment. "Frankie, pack your things. Get out," he said coldly, without waiting to hear my side. The finality in his voice made the room spin. Mark, my husband, was standing just behind me. His eyes were wide, helpless. He wanted to intervene, to calm everyone down, but even he knew this was a fire no one could just put out with a few words. I gathered my things, my hands trembling. My kids were watching from the living room, wide-eyed and silent, not understanding why Mommy was suddenly being thrown out of the house she'd helped keep afloat for years. The $9,000 necklace wasn't just a necklace. It was a symbol of trust, of family bonds that suddenly felt like they'd been severed clean. And just like that, the fragile calm that had held us together for so long shattered into pieces. I left the house feeling like all the numbers I'd crunched in my life, the budgets, the payments, the nights spent covering costs so Lauren and Dad could stay comfortable, meant nothing in the face of a single loud accusation. That morning wasn't just about a necklace. It was the beginning of a fracture so deep, it would change everything. The cracks in our family didn't just appear overnight. They had been quietly spreading for years, worn thin by favoritism, misunderstandings, and unspoken resentments. It started back when Lauren was a kid, and Dad's attention felt like a spotlight that shone solely on her. I remember vividly how Dad would lavish Lauren with gifts, expensive clothes, the latest gadgets, even those grand vacations that seemed to make our house buzz with excitement and envy. Meanwhile, my own efforts were met with barely a nod or a polite thank you that felt more obligatory than heartfelt. Lauren was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. When she threw tantrums at the grocery store or refused to do her chores, Dad's face softened, and he would tell me, "She's just sensitive. You have to be patient." But when I pushed back or showed frustration, There was a coldness in his eyes, a silent judgment that I was too difficult, or not trying hard enough. I swallowed my hurt then, telling myself it was just how parenting worked, that she needed extra care, and I had to be the responsible one. But the feeling of being sidelined, of not quite belonging, was a quiet ache that settled deep inside me. Money became an unspoken battlefield. From the moment I started earning my own paychecks, I took on more responsibility. I paid for my own college, then helped Lauren with hers, covering tuition and those little extras she claimed she couldn't afford. I managed the rent, the utilities, the groceries, and even Lauren's therapy payments, things she never mentioned and never offered to repay. I thought it was just part of being family, a sacrifice that would pay off in love and gratitude. But what I got in return was silence. The more I gave, the more invisible my contributions became. And yet, I tried to hold on to hope. At family dinners, I smiled through the polite chatter, pretending everything was fine. I believed that if I kept being the steady one, if I kept the peace, things would eventually balance out. But Lauren's entitlement only grew with every unchecked favor. She became bolder, more demanding, expecting me to drop everything whenever she called, assuming I'd cover whatever emergency cropped up. I remember one Christmas when Dad gave Lauren a designer handbag worth more than my entire month's salary. I smiled and thanked him for my gift, an impulse toaster, while Lauren twirled her new bag like a trophy. The disparity wasn't lost on me, but I kept quiet. It was easier that way. The emotional landscape was just as fraught. Lauren's manipulation was subtle but sharp. She knew how to twist words, how to make Dad see her as the victim whenever I spoke up. "Frankie's just jealous," she'd say with a saccharine smile, and Dad would nod, eyes softening. I was the problem, the troublemaker, the one who never appreciated how much Lauren had already been given. I can't count the times I caught myself shrinking in family photo albums, my smile forced, my presence fading into the background. I was the reliable, invisible sister, the one who paid the bills, kept the peace, and swallowed the slights. Every dollar I spent, every hour I sacrificed, was tracked only by me. No one else seemed to notice or care. The house we shared, the one I helped pay for, felt more like a gilded cage. I was tethered there by financial responsibility, but emotionally untethered. The walls echoed with Lauren's laughter, her demands, and Dad's favoritism, while I quietly carried the weight of everything no one else wanted to acknowledge. Looking back, I realize now how normalized it all had become. My sacrifices were expected, taken for granted, and dismissed. I rationalized it as family duty, but the truth was clear. I had been funding a one-sided relationship, one that rewarded Lauren's entitlement and Dad's blind favoritism while erasing my own value. That silent ledger, the one no one else could see, was full of debts that would never be repaid, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks widened into cracks that couldn't be smoothed over with passive smiles or hollow apologies. The reality was, I was the one holding the financial reins tight in our family. Every month, without fail, I paid nearly all of the $2,400 rent for the house Lauren and I shared. She was supposed to cover her half, $800, but more often than not, she'd say she was tight on cash, or that the money had slipped her mind. Somehow, the rent always ended up coming out of my account. It wasn't just rent either. Utilities, electricity, water, gas, internet, all of those bills landed on my doorstep. I logged each payment meticulously, but there was no acknowledgement, no thank you text, no acknowledgement in the family group chat, just silence. Lauren's therapy sessions were another financial drain I absorbed without complaint. Mental health wasn't cheap. Month after month, I covered her therapy copays and even the bills her insurance didn't cover. The therapists were supposed to be helping her work through anxiety and other issues, but I never heard her thank me, or even mention how much it cost. She treated the sessions like a right, not a privilege. Yet I convinced myself it was important, that supporting her mental health was part of what sisters did. I didn't always have extra money to spare. I remember skipping lunches on more than one occasion to cover her fees, or putting back a new jacket I really needed because one of the utility bills was unexpectedly high. My own wants and needs became background noise to the constant hum of responsibility I carried. I was exhausted, financially and emotionally, but I buried it deep, telling myself, it's just what family means. Mark, my husband, noticed how tired I was. He'd watch me late at night, hunched over bills or laptop spreadsheets, barely able to keep my eyes open. "You're doing too much," he'd say softly, worry creasing his brow. But I brushed it off, brushing away his concern with a tired smile. "I've got this," I'd say. I wanted to be the dependable one, the rock, the steady hand holding the family's chaotic pieces together. Helping Lauren through college was another chapter in this ongoing story of sacrifice. I remember the day she called me after her first semester, panicked about tuition and books. I didn't hesitate. I wired her money for tuition, picked up her textbooks, and even lent her my old laptop when hers broke. Every time she needed something, I was the bank, the chauffeur, the emotional crutch. Meanwhile, I juggled my own career. Endless meetings, budget deadlines, and performance reviews, while making sure Lauren never missed a payment or felt unsupported. Despite all this, gratitude was a scarce commodity. Lauren's entitlement only grew as the years passed. She began to expect my help as a birthright. If I couldn't help, she'd throw a tantrum, lash out, or sulk for days. It wasn't just about money, it was about power and control. I was the one who kept the lights on, literally and figuratively. But I was also the one who got blamed for any disruption in the household harmony. Family dinners were a minefield. While I smiled and made small talk, Lauren would drop pointed comments about how I was the responsible drone, or how I lived to serve. Dad, ever the enabler, would laugh along or roll his eyes at my stubbornness. These dinners were performances, and I was the understudy who never got the spotlight. I remember one particular evening when I quietly mentioned to Dad that I'd covered Lauren's therapy bills for the last 6 months. Instead of gratitude, I got a scoff. "You can't buy love, Frankie," he said dismissively, his eyes barely meeting mine. Lauren laughed, echoing Dad's sentiment. The sting of their words lingered long after the plates were cleared, and the guests had gone home. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself that someday, Lauren would recognize what I'd done for her, that my sacrifices would be seen, appreciated, maybe even reciprocated. I imagined a future where family loyalty would be mutual, where my role as the provider wasn't invisible but valued. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My own needs and dreams had been pushed aside for years. I was a silent partner in a one-sided equation, and the balance was tipping dangerously toward resentment. If only I had realized then that the ledger I kept so carefully, the tally of support, sacrifices, and financial lifelines, was a record of what I was losing, not gaining. That my generosity was feeding a cycle of entitlement and neglect, rather than love and respect. I was running on fumes, but still, I kept paying, hoping that my sister and my family would eventually see me not as the steady checkbook, but as the sister, the daughter, the woman I was underneath it all. That family gathering was supposed to be just another routine event, the usual clinking of glasses, forced laughter, and the uneasy dance around the undercurrents we all refused to acknowledge. We gathered in Dad's living room, the same one where we'd commemorated birthdays and holidays for years. The faint scent of roasted chicken lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle hum of a classic rock album Dad insisted on playing, the one Lauren always complained about. I was tired but hopeful that this time things might be a little different. I had just received a promotion at work, a significant milestone after years of grinding through budgets and tightening financial belts. It wasn't flashy, but it was hard-earned. I wanted to share it with my family, hoping, maybe naively, that my accomplishments would finally register, that they'd see me as more than just the unpaid landlord and wallet. I cleared my throat and said, "Dad, I got promoted to senior financial manager at the nonprofit. It's a big step for me." My voice was steady, but inside I was holding my breath, waiting for some sign of approval. Instead, Dad barely looked up from his plate, his expression flat, distracted. "That's nice, Frankie," he muttered dismissively. Then, without missing a beat, he added, loud enough for everyone to hear, "But all that work just keeps you chained to your desk. Look at Lauren. She's out there living life, going to parties, meeting interesting people. She's the one having real fun, not you." A ripple of laughter echoed around the room. Lauren's eyes sparkled with that smug satisfaction she always wore like a shield, and she tilted her head, flashing a tight smile. "Yeah, Frankie, you're like a responsible drone," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "All work and no play." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to tilt, the cheerful chatter dimming into a low, mocking murmur. I forced a smile, swallowing the tight lump forming in my throat. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to remind them how much I'd done, but the words stuck in my mouth. Gathering courage, I said quietly, "I've been covering Lauren's therapy bills for months now, and the rent, utilities. I keep this house running." Dad scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if I'd just made a ridiculous claim. "You can't buy love with money, Frankie. That's not what family is about." His tone was cold, final, and the room fell silent, the weight of his judgment heavy in the air. Lauren burst into laughter, the kind that sparkled with cruelty masked as amusement. "Yeah, you're just throwing money at us hoping we'll like you. It's pathetic," she sneered. I felt all eyes on me, but there was no sympathy, only derision. My hands clenched into fists on my lap, nails digging into my skin. The humiliation of being branded pathetic in front of family stabbed deeper than any argument could. Inside, I was burning, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. Years of sacrifice, sweat, and silent endurance reduced to a punchline. I was the dependable one, the behind-the-scenes fixer, but in their eyes, I was just a drone, a bank account, not a sister or daughter. The evening dragged on after that, the conversations turning cold and clipped. Lauren continued to needle me with thinly veiled barbs, and Dad sided with her every time, his eyes hardening when I tried to speak up. I remember the way the air felt, thick and suffocating, as if I were shrinking in the space I'd occupied for years. When I finally left that night, the weight of invisibility was crushing. I wondered, for the first time out loud, if my efforts would ever amount to anything more than background noise in a family that couldn't see me for who I truly was. That night didn't just sting. It echoed a truth I'd tried to ignore. In this family, my worth was measured by approval I'd never get, and my sacrifices were invisible coins tossed into an endless well of entitlement and disregard. That morning began like any other, or so I thought. The pale light was just starting to spill through the curtains when Lauren stormed into the kitchen, her voice shattering the early calm like a siren. "My $9,000 diamond necklace. She took it. Frankie, where is it?" Her words screamed accusation, each syllable cutting through the quiet of the house. I stood frozen, the coffee pot halfway to pouring, the warm brown liquid trembling in my hand. My heart pounded, confusion twisting inside me. "Lauren, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't seen your necklace," I said carefully, trying to steady my voice, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes blazed with fury, wild and desperate. "Stop lying. You were the only one in my room. You took it. I'm sure of it." The kitchen suddenly felt claustrophobic, the air thick and heavy. My mind raced, scrambling to understand how things had escalated so quickly. All those years of quietly paying the bills, covering her therapy copays, and holding our family's fragile peace felt like they'd evaporated in an instant. I was suddenly the villain in a story I never asked to be part of. Before I could take a breath, the front door banged open again. Dad appeared, his face hard and unreadable. "Frankie, pack your things. Get out," he ordered, his voice cold and sharp, like a judge passing sentence with no jury or evidence. There was no pause, no question, just a final, brutal command. The shock of it knocked me off balance. The sister who paid nearly everything, who kept the household afloat, was now being cast out as the thief. Mark, standing silently behind me, looked torn, his eyes begging for calm, for reason. But even he knew this wasn't about reason anymore. It was about a family fracture that had come crashing down. I felt my hands shake as I started gathering a few belongings. Some clothes, my phone, a small bag. My children watched from the living room, their faces wide-eyed and confused. They didn't understand why Mommy was suddenly being pushed out of the home she'd fought so hard to keep standing. their small hands clutched at Mark's trousers, eyes searching for answers that weren't coming. Lauren's accusation wasn't just about a missing necklace. That diamond piece was a symbol of trust, of shared history, of family loyalty. But that symbol had become sharp, a weapon used against me. The necklace was the spark, but the fire it ignited was years of unseen hurt and resentment. As I stood there, heart pounding, I glanced at Dad's face, stern, unwavering, no flicker of doubt, no glance toward me for an explanation. It was like I had ceased to exist, reduced to an accusation and an order. All my years of sacrifices, the late nights crunching numbers to cover rent and utilities, the countless times I had been the silent backbone of this family, it was erased in a moment. Mark stepped forward, his voice low and strained. "Richard, please, let's just talk this through." But Dad shook his head, resolute. "There's nothing to talk about. Frankie took it, and she needs to leave." Lauren's eyes burned with triumph. Her lips curled in a victorious smirk. It was as if the accusation was a weapon she'd been waiting to use, and now it had landed home. I felt a hollow space open inside me, swallowing years of hope and effort. The house, once a place of shared memories and complex love, now felt like a cage snapping shut. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the seconds as I packed, each tick a reminder of the growing distance between who I was and who I was being made out to be. My children clung to Mark, whispering questions I couldn't answer. Their innocence was the sharpest pain of all. How do you explain to little ones that the sister who kept the lights on, who filled the fridge, who paid for their favorite snacks, was suddenly being thrown out? That the sister they called Mom was now a stranger accused of betrayal? I paused at the threshold, looking back at the house, the walls that had witnessed laughter, tears, and unspoken sacrifices. I thought about every rent check I'd written, every utility bill I'd paid, every therapy copay I'd covered for Lauren. And yet, here I was, the accused thief, the outcast. That morning wasn't just a confrontation. It was a rupture, a public unraveling that exposed the raw fault lines beneath our family's surface. The necklace was missing, yes, but what was truly missing was trust. And without it, the foundation we'd been barely holding together crumbled into dust. As I stepped out the door, the cold air hit my face like a shock. I felt the weight of not just my bags, but the years of invisible labor and love that had been cast aside. My heart ached, but beneath the pain, a quiet voice whispered, "This wasn't the end." Something had changed irreversibly, and the days ahead would demand more than just forgiveness. They would demand reckoning. Walking away from the house, I realized that the fracture that had been quietly growing between us was no longer just an undercurrent. It was a chasm yawning wide, threatening to swallow the family whole. And somehow, I had to find a way to navigate the wreckage. The moment I closed the door behind me that morning, the floodgates of grief burst open. I sank onto the worn bench in the small park near our house, the cold bite of early spring air doing little to numb the ache inside. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, a place where I'd long kept a silent tally of every cent I'd spent supporting this family. It was time to face the truth I'd been avoiding. I scrolled through the entries: rent payments, monthly utilities, therapy bills, grocery runs, school supplies, unexpected car repairs for Lauren's old clunker. The numbers piled up, tens of thousands over the years. Each line item wasn't just a transaction, it was a story of sacrifice, a quiet act of love no one had acknowledged. My chest tightened as I realized how invisible I'd become, how much I'd given without so much as a thank you. The necklace accusation, the moment that had shattered everything, felt like the cruelest punctuation mark on a long, painful sentence. It wasn't about the diamond-studded heirloom itself. It was about trust broken, about a bond so fragile it snapped under the weight of suspicion. That necklace was a symbol, a treasured piece that should have represented family unity, but instead, it became the weapon that drove a wedge between us. I thought about every time I'd chosen to put my own needs aside. The dinners I'd skipped because I was paying for Lauren's therapy copays, or the hours I'd stayed late at work to cover rent while Lauren was off at parties. I remembered the nights lying awake, calculating bills in my head, swallowing exhaustion so I could keep the household afloat. Those sacrifices no longer felt like acts of kindness. They felt like chains, binding me to a family that didn't see me. Tears stung my eyes, but beneath the sorrow, an unfamiliar clarity began to emerge. I wasn't just hurting, I was awakening. Years of silent endurance and unspoken debts had culminated in this moment of reckoning. I realized that I had been more than just generous. I'd been exploited. My goodwill had been mistaken for weakness, my reliability for an endless bank account. A cold, hard truth settled in. I owed them nothing. No more rent checks, no more covering bills they conveniently forgot to pay, no more therapy fees that Lauren never even acknowledged. The invisible ledger was full, and my emotional bank was bankrupt. I thought about Mark, who had watched helplessly as I was thrown out. His quiet support was a lifeline, but even he couldn't shield me from the sting of betrayal. For years, I'd hidden this pain behind a calm exterior, but now, the mask was slipping, replaced by a resolve I hadn't dared to claim before. I pictured my children, their innocent faces watching me pack, confused and scared. They didn't deserve this drama any more than I did. If I wanted to protect them, to show them the strength it takes to stand up for yourself, I needed to stop sacrificing my dignity for a family that refused to value it. A sense of anger flickered to life, sharp and purposeful. It wasn't the wild, destructive rage that blinds you. It was cold, measured, the kind that fuels change. I promised myself I wouldn't be a victim of their false accusations or favoritism any longer. I would reclaim control, set clear boundaries, and demand respect, even if it meant walking away. I looked up at the sky, the pale morning light filtering through the bare branches above. The world was waking up, oblivious to the storm inside me. But inside, I felt a quiet revolution stirring, a determination to stop being invisible, to stop paying for love that was never returned. The necklace had been the last straw, but it was also a catalyst. It forced me to see the family for what it truly was, a system built on imbalance, on giving without receiving, on conditional loyalty. If I was going to survive, I needed to rewrite the rules. As I gathered my scattered thoughts, I knew the days ahead would be difficult. There would be anger, confusion, and probably more accusations. But beneath it all was a new foundation, one built not on blind sacrifice, but on self-respect and clear boundaries. I whispered to myself, steady and sure, I owe them nothing. I'm done. The words felt like a shield, protecting me from the weight of years of unseen betrayal. And just like that, the grief that had threatened to drown me transformed into something fierce, a resolve to reclaim my life, my worth, and my peace. The fractures in my family were deep, but I was no longer willing to be the one who kept patching them up alone. This clarity was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would no longer be the silent, invisible sister, but the woman who finally stood up and said, "Enough." After the storm of that morning, I felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground beneath me shifting and uncertain. But beneath the rawness of betrayal, something else was stirring, a need for clarity, for order in the chaos. I pulled out my laptop and opened a fresh spreadsheet, determined to document every cent I had poured into this family over the years. It wasn't just about numbers. I needed to see the full scope of what I'd given, to face the truth in black and white. As I typed, each line felt heavier than the last. Rent payments, one $600 here, one $600 there, month after month, year after year. Utilities, electricity, gas, water, internet, logged meticulously with payment dates and amounts. Therapy fees for Lauren's sessions, including co-pays and uncovered costs, filled in the gaps. I added in grocery runs, the repairs on Lauren's battered car, school supplies for my niece Emily, even those last-minute expenses I'd quietly covered so Lauren could stay afloat. The spreadsheet grew, detailed, precise, a ledger of love and exhaustion. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was more than just accounting. It was a mirror reflecting years of invisible labor, a story I'd never told aloud. The numbers were staggering, a silent testimony to how much I had sustained a household that barely acknowledged my effort. I saved the file as Family Support Log, the name feeling cold but fitting. But documenting wasn't enough. I knew I needed to protect myself now, not just emotionally, but legally. The necklace accusation had exposed how fragile the trust was, and I couldn't let my family's entitlement endanger my future. I reached out to my longtime lawyer, someone I trusted implicitly, Laura. I explained the situation carefully, omitting emotion, focusing on facts. Laura listened without interruption, her voice calm but firm. "We need to update your will and financial arrangements," she said. "If you want to exclude Lauren and Richard, we can do that. It's your right, especially given the circumstances." Hearing it spoken aloud was surreal. The idea of severing financial ties with family felt harsh, but also necessary. We discussed changing passwords to shared bank accounts and online services, another layer of protection. Laura recommended setting up separate accounts for any future family-related payments I might still decide to make, but only with clear boundaries. I nodded, absorbing the weight of each step. That night, back at home, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. I began drafting a letter, a final, unambiguous message to my family. No accusations, no emotional appeals, just facts and boundaries. I wrote slowly, choosing words that were firm yet measured, a reflection of the resolve I was cultivating. The letter explained that I was withdrawing all financial support immediately. Rent, utilities, therapy fees, everything was now my responsibility alone, and I would no longer cover costs for anyone else. I stated clearly that my decision wasn't made lightly, but was necessary for my well-being. The note ended simply, "Good luck." As I folded the letter neatly, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For years, my generosity had been taken for granted, my patience mistaken for weakness. Now, I was drawing a line, a boundary I hadn't dared to set before. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about reclaiming my dignity. Meanwhile, outwardly, I maintained the same composed facade I always wore. I answered calls and messages with measured politeness, careful not to reveal the storm brewing beneath. No one suspected that beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was underway. I was preparing to stop being the family's safety net, to stop being the invisible benefactor who could be thrown out on a whim. I thought about Mark, who had stood by me even when powerless to intervene. I shared the spreadsheet with him, letting him see the full scope of what I'd been carrying alone. His expression was a mix of shock and sorrow, but also relief that I was finally facing the truth openly. Together, we discussed the practical steps ahead, how to manage the house without Lauren's presence, how to protect our children from the fallout, how to navigate the inevitable backlash. Mark's support was a steady anchor in what felt like a stormy sea. In the quiet of that evening, as the house settled around us, I realized something profound. I was no longer a silent victim. The ledger, the lawyer's counsel, the letter, they were tools of empowerment. Boundaries were not walls, but bridges to a healthier future, even if that future meant distance from those I once called family. The next morning, I would begin putting these plans into motion, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult and fraught with conflict. But for the first time in years, I felt ready, not because the hurt had vanished, but because I had chosen myself. And that choice was the first step toward reclaiming my life. That morning, after the decision had settled heavy in my chest like a stone, I made a quiet vow: no more silent sacrifices. The first step was simple but monumental. I stopped answering Lauren's texts. It wasn't a dramatic cutoff at first, just a deliberate absence. Her messages would pop up, urgent pleas, passive-aggressive jabs, or vague cries for help. But I let them sit, unread, my phone screen dimming without a reply. I knew she'd notice the silence. She always did. Then came the weekend family dinners, the supposed bonding time, the ritual we all clung to despite the tension lurking underneath. I declined every invitation, citing exhaustion or work commitments. I watched from the sidelines as the house filled with their laughter and thin smiles without me. Part of me ached to be there, to keep the fragile peace, but another part, the one that had been bruised and ignored for years, knew I had to step back to protect myself. Each refusal felt like peeling off a second skin, exposing raw nerves underneath. but also opening space for healing. Gradually, I began to pull back financially. The rent payments were the first domino. For years, I had been covering nearly all of the $2,400 monthly rent, quietly absorbing Lauren's supposed share of $800 that rarely arrived on time, if at all. I started by transferring only my portion, the $1,600, and stopped covering Lauren's share altogether. I waited, expecting excuses, reminders, or confrontation, but the silence that followed was deafening. No texts asking about the missing payment, no calls explaining the delay. It was as if the entire financial responsibility had shifted overnight, and I was no longer their bailout. The utility bills followed. Electricity, water, gas, internet. Each monthly invoice was another weight on my shoulders. I began paying only for my personal usage, disconnecting shared accounts where possible and requesting separate bills. It was a bureaucratic hassle, but necessary. My name was no longer on the hook for expenses I had been shouldering alone. I can still remember the chill of the first utility bill left unpaid from Lauren's side, the quiet threat it posed to the household's comfort. It felt like a small victory and a warning shot all at once. The most difficult cut was Lauren's therapy sessions. Mental health was a delicate subject, one I had never questioned, even as I questioned everything else. Those monthly co-pays and uncovered fees had been my burden for years, a silent promise I made to support her when no one else would. But now, I canceled the appointments, informing the clinic that Lauren was responsible for payments going forward. I knew this would force a reckoning, and I braced myself for the fallout. It wasn't cruelty, it was boundary. I could no longer finance her struggles while being vilified as a thief and cast out. As I implemented these changes, I found myself balancing a strange cocktail of emotions. Guilt swirled, reminding me of all the times I had promised to keep the peace. Relief surfaced in quiet moments, a breath finally drawn after years of holding it in, and anger simmered beneath everything, a slow-burning fire of betrayal and injustice. Each financial step I took felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been lost in the family's unbalanced ledger. The family noticed the shift, of course. There were lingering glances when bills arrived late or not at all, whispered frustrations about Frankie's stubbornness, and a few pointed comments in group texts, thinly veiled attempts at guilt and manipulation. But I stood firm, watching the fragile web of entitlement begin to unravel. The house, once humming with comfortable dependency, grew quieter, emptier. Even Mark, my anchor through all this, understood the gravity of what I was doing. He helped me set up new accounts, organized payments, and reminded me gently that I was doing the right thing, even if it felt harsh. Our late-night conversations were full of practical planning, but also quiet affirmations of hope. "You're not alone," he'd whisper, squeezing my hand. I wasn't naive. I knew this was just the beginning. The fallout would come. The accusations and manipulations would intensify. But for the first time, I was no longer the invisible one paying for everyone else's comfort. I was drawing boundaries where none had existed, and while it was painful, it was necessary. Most importantly, I was starting to protect my family, the children who deserved stability, respect, and a mother who wasn't drowning under the weight of unreciprocated sacrifice. The house that had felt like a gilded cage was beginning to feel like a place where I might reclaim control. Every unanswered text, every declined dinner, every bill unpaid by my family was a brick laid in a new foundation, one built on dignity, self-respect, and hard-earned boundaries. The necklace accusation had broken trust, but from those broken pieces, I was beginning to build something stronger. A life where my worth wasn't measured by what I gave away, but by the respect I demanded. And as the days passed and the silences grew louder, I knew the family was waking slowly to a reality they hadn't prepared for, that the safety net had vanished, and I was no longer their financial crutch. The next steps would be harder, the conflicts sharper, but I was ready to face them, armed with the clarity that I owed them nothing anymore. This was the calm before the storm, the quiet before the inevitable reckoning, and deep inside, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That morning, The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft drip of the coffee maker, the rising sun casting long shadows across the countertop. I stood there, the letter folded neatly in my hand, a simple sheet of paper that carried more weight than any conversation I'd had in years. I placed it carefully on the kitchen counter, right where I knew everyone would see it, the crossroads of our shared lives. The words were short, deliberate. Good luck. No explanations, no apologies, just a boundary drawn in ink. Delivering that note was both terrifying and liberating. For so long, I had been the family's invisible bank, the silent provider who paid every bill, smoothed every conflict, and swallowed every insult. I had hoped my sacrifices would earn me respect or gratitude, but instead I was accused, dismissed, and finally thrown out. The necklace accusation was the last straw, but this note was my quiet declaration. I was done. After leaving the letter, I sat down with Mark, the weight of what I was about to do settling over us both. I revealed the full extent of my financial support, how I had been shouldering nearly every expense in that house we all called home. Mark's face was a mixture of shock and sorrow, but also of relief, as if finally hearing the truth out loud lifted some of the burden we had both been carrying in silence. Together, we made the calls. I contacted my lawyer, Laura, a steady presence who helped me navigate the difficult legal steps. We updated my will to exclude both Lauren and Dad, Richard, from any inheritance. It was a painful but necessary choice. I wanted to protect myself and my children from further exploitation. I changed passwords on all shared accounts, severing the financial ties that had bound me to a family that no longer respected me. While all this was happening behind closed doors, the family awoke that morning to a new reality. The rent check from me never arrived. Utilities went unpaid on Lauren's side. The therapy appointments canceled without warning. Their usual lifeline, the quiet financial support they'd taken for granted, was gone. I imagined the confusion, the panic as bills piled up and texts went unanswered. I knew they didn't yet grasp the full extent of what I'd done. Richard called within hours, his voice sharp and demanding an explanation for the sudden silence and missed payments. Lauren's phone buzzed incessantly with messages, not gentle inquiries, but veiled threats and guilt trips, blaming me for the chaos. Both of them believed they could manipulate their way back to the status quo, but I stayed silent. Mark stood by my side as the fallout began. He supported my decision, even as he felt torn between loyalty to me and pressure from his own in-laws. We both knew this was only the beginning of a long, painful process. That day, the house we shared, the one I had kept afloat, felt eerily empty, the quiet a stark contrast to the usual bustle of daily life. Without my financial support, the fragile structure they depended on started to crack. The foundation I had labored to maintain was gone, and with it, the illusions of unconditional family loyalty. But amidst the turmoil, I felt a strange calm. The note on the counter was more than just words. It was a shield, a promise to myself that I would no longer be the invisible martyr. I was no longer willing to fund their comfort while being vilified and cast aside. As I looked out the window that morning, the sunlight illuminating the worn hardwood floors, I realized that this moment marked a turning point. The necklace accusation had shattered the family's fragile facade, but my firm withdrawal of support was the beginning of something new, a reckoning they hadn't expected, and a boundary they hadn't respected until it was too late. There was no turning back now. The quiet good luck on the kitchen counter was both a farewell and a warning. The family would have to face the consequences of their actions, and I would stand firm, no longer invisible, no longer silent. And so the house waited in uneasy silence, the calm before the storm that was sure to come. The phone started ringing almost immediately after they found my note. Richard's name flashed on the screen, a relentless barrage that wouldn't stop. Each call was sharper than the last, his voice dripping with accusation, disbelief, and entitlement. "Frankie, you owe me an explanation. What is this stunt? You can't just cut us off like this. You need to apologize." His words felt like daggers slicing through the fragile calm I'd been trying to build around myself. I let the calls go to voicemail, but he just kept coming back, like a storm that wouldn't break. His tone was demanding. his anger barely concealed beneath a veneer of faux concern. "You think this is some kind of power play? Your family. You don't abandon your family." The phrase stung because it was twisted. He was the one abandoning me by casting me out on a baseless accusation. But I stayed silent, refusing to give him the reaction he craved. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed incessantly with messages from Lauren. At first, there were desperate pleas. "Frankie, please talk to me. This isn't you. I know you didn't do anything wrong." But those soon morphed into guilt trips and blame. "You're tearing this family apart. If you just admit you took the necklace, we could fix this. You're making everyone miserable." The texts were a poison, each one dripping with manipulation. Lauren painted herself as the victim, framing me as the villain who was ruining everything. But I knew the truth. I was the one who had been sustaining this family's comfort while being treated like an intruder. Lauren's messages, full of blame and distortion, only confirmed the toxic pattern I was breaking free from. Mark watched the storm unfold quietly, his support unwavering but his eyes heavy with the weight of divided loyalties. I could see how torn he was, between standing by me and the pressure from his own family to smooth things over. He stayed by my side, listening through the late-night calls, offering quiet reassurances when the exhaustion threatened to pull me under. "Frankie," he said one evening, voice low with concern, "they're trying to pull you back in, but you've done what you needed to do. Don't let them drag you into their chaos." His words were a balm, reminding me that this fight was mine, but I wasn't alone. Still, I sensed the strain between us. Mark was caught in a storm that wasn't his, and I hated that my family's drama was pulling at the threads of our marriage. The family group texts were another battlefield. They exploded with accusations masked as concern, thinly veiled attempts to guilt me into returning to the fold. "Please don't do this, Frankie. We need you," one message read. Another accused me of being selfish. "After all I've done for you." The passive aggression was venomous, but I refused to respond. Each ignored text was a small victory, a reclaiming of power I hadn't felt in years. At home, the consequences of my withdrawal began to ripple through the household. Rent notices arrived with stern warnings. Utility bills piled up unpaid. The once warm house grew colder, quieter, an echo of the disintegration I had silently initiated. I could almost hear the walls groan under the weight of neglect, a stark contrast to the years I had held everything together. Mark and I moved carefully through the tension, shielding our children from the upheaval as best we could. Emily's innocent questions about why Aunt Lauren is upset, or why does Grandma keep calling Mommy, were met with gentle honesty that never crossed into blame. Protecting our little ones became a quiet mission, a source of strength amid the chaos. Despite the turmoil, I remained resolute. Each demand for explanations, every guilt-laden message, I met with silence or a firm, measured reply. I refused to be pulled back into the toxic dynamic. My boundaries were clear, and I stood by them, even as the fallout deepened. This was the moment where everything shifted. The family who had depended on me financially and emotionally was now forced to face a reality without their safety net. Their panic was palpable, their confusion sharp, and yet I held steady, knowing that this turmoil was the price of reclaiming my dignity. The calls, the texts, the empty house, they were the echo of a family waking up to consequences they had long ignored. And as the storm swirled outside, inside I found a strange calm, a quiet confidence that I was no longer invisible or expendable. The battle lines were drawn, the war over control and respect underway, and at the center of it all stood a woman who finally said, "No more." The aftermath rippled through the family like a shockwave, each day bringing new challenges they hadn't anticipated. Rent notices arrived thick and fast, bearing stern warnings that couldn't be ignored. The house, which for years had hummed with a false sense of ease under my unspoken financial care, suddenly felt cold and empty. The lights flickered dimmer as the electricity bill went unpaid, water shut off for a day or two, and the internet slowed to a crawl. Without my steady payments, the fragile ecosystem that had kept the family afloat began to unravel. Lauren's therapy sessions, once a small but consistent thread of support, came to an abrupt halt. The clinic's receptionist delivered the news with a sympathetic sigh when she called to reschedule Lauren's upcoming appointment. The fees were overdue, and without coverage, the appointments were canceled indefinitely. I knew how much those sessions meant to Lauren, not only as a space to vent and heal, but as a lifeline she secretly clung to. Yet, after years of my quiet subsidizing, I was no longer willing or able to pick up the tab for her emotional safety net, especially when she wielded accusations like weapons. At the same time, the strain took a visible toll on Dad, Richard. He was a man who had always carried himself with a rigid pride, stoic and unyielding. But in the weeks following my withdrawal of support, the cracks in his armor began to show. His health deteriorated under the weight of stress and worry that no one openly acknowledged. He stopped sleeping well, his usual sharpness dulled by fatigue and anxiety. Often I'd get a phone call from Mark telling me Dad had been dizzy or short of breath, but Dad stubbornly refused to see a doctor. Eventually, the inevitable happened. One afternoon, Mark called me with a voice tight and strained. "Frankie, Dad's been taken to the hospital. He collapsed while getting the mail. They're running tests now." I felt a rush of complicated emotions, concern mixed with frustration. Could this have been prevented if he'd just set aside his pride and accepted help? But now, in the sterile, white-lit hospital room, there was no room for blame, only the stark reality of consequences. Hospital visits became frequent. I found myself there one evening, sitting in the waiting room with Mark, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. Dad was reluctant, agitated. He hated being vulnerable. But these moments, though painful, stripped away some of the facades. We talked more than we had in years, his voice sometimes softer, tinged with regret. Yet, even as he grappled with his health, the distance between us was vast, an unspoken acknowledgement of the damage beneath the surface. Outside the immediate family, whispers started to circulate among extended relatives. The Allen family's reputation, once carefully maintained behind closed doors, began to fray. I heard from a cousin who called cautiously, expressing sympathy but also surprise at the sudden change. "Are you okay, Frankie? I didn't realize things were so bad." Their words were a reminder that the family drama was no longer contained. The fissures had grown visible. Lauren, meanwhile, played the role of the victim to anyone who would listen. With her usual charm and practiced vulnerability, she spun stories of betrayal and heartache. Friends and acquaintances who had known her for years hesitated, sensing cracks in her narrative but unsure where the truth lay. Her isolation deepened even as she sought sympathy, revealing the loneliness that often hides behind entitlement. Through it all, I documented every interaction, texts, calls, voicemails, creating a detailed record of the unfolding chaos. It wasn't about gathering ammunition for a fight, but about protecting myself and my children should the battles escalate. This ledger was my shield, a testament to the painful lessons I'd learned about trust and family. Some distant relatives reached out privately, offering quiet support. Their words, simple and sincere, were like lifelines. "We see what you're going through. You deserve better. Don't give up on yourself." These small gestures reminded me that I wasn't completely alone, and that the truth, however messy, had a way of finding light. Despite the swirling storm, I found moments of unexpected strength. The house, though colder and quieter, was no longer a place where my worth was measured in dollars and silent suffering. It was a space where I was beginning to reclaim myself, one bill unpaid, one boundary firmly drawn at a time. The family's unraveling was painful, the consequences real and raw. But within that pain, I sensed the possibility of change, not just for me, but maybe, just maybe, for all of us. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with tension, but I was no longer willing to be the invisible victim. This was the moment when fractures deepened, but also where new beginnings quietly sparked. Months have passed since I left that suffocating house behind, since the day I placed that note on the kitchen counter, a simple, cold good luck that carried the weight of years of invisible sacrifice and unspoken pain. Life didn't magically fix itself the moment I stopped being the family's ATM and emotional punching bag. But something profound shifted inside me. I began to rebuild, not just the tangible pieces of my life, but the very boundaries and sense of self I'd lost amid the chaos. Mark and I moved into a smaller place, a quiet sanctuary where the air is lighter and the shadows of past betrayals don't seem to linger as heavily. Emily's laughter fills the rooms in ways I never thought possible during those dark days. Watching her run through the house, carefree and safe, reminds me why I had to cut those ties, to protect not only myself but my children's innocence too. For the first time in years, I'm the one setting the rules for our home, and it feels like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't know was missing. Rebuilding wasn't easy. The silence from my family was deafening at first. No calls, no messages, no attempts to mend what they'd broken. I had to accept that my withdrawal wasn't just a pause. It was a fracture too deep for a quick fix. But I wasn't bitter. I was clear-headed. I knew that love and loyalty don't thrive in an environment where respect is absent and generosity is met with suspicion. I made a choice. If my family wanted a place in my life again, it would be on my terms. Respect, honesty, and accountability would be the pillars of any future contact. I wasn't interested in empty apologies or vague promises. They needed to show they had changed, to prove they valued me beyond what I could provide financially. That meant no more false accusations, no more favoritism, no more blind trust that I would silently absorb their neglect. I drafted a letter outlining these boundaries, not as a threat, but as a necessary framework for any chance at rebuilding our broken relationship. I told them clearly that I was open to dialogue, but only if it came from a place of genuine respect and honesty. I invited them to acknowledge the past wrongs and to start the painful work of making amends. I left the door open, but only just enough for them to step through with humility. Richard and Lauren didn't respond right away. I sensed their discomfort and confusion. How could they face the reality that the sister they once dismissed was no longer willing to be a doormat? The house, once filled with their demands and entitlement, stood empty of my support, and it unsettled them in ways they hadn't anticipated. I could almost hear the quiet panic behind the closed doors, the frantic scrambling to adjust to a life without the invisible safety net. Mark stood beside me through it all, my anchor and my mirror. He reminded me constantly that my worth wasn't tied to anyone's approval, but my own. "You didn't lose a family," he said one night as we sat sipping tea under the soft glow of our living room lamp. "You gained your freedom." His words became a mantra I clung to during moments of doubt. The healing process was gradual. I focused on myself and Emily, nurturing what had been neglected for too long. I started therapy again, not for anyone else's sake, but for mine, to unpack the layers of guilt and self-doubt that had accumulated over the years. I learned to celebrate my resilience, to honor the boundaries I set as acts of courage, not cruelty. Occasionally, I'd hear through the grapevine that the family was struggling. Rumors of eviction notices, unpaid bills, and strained relationships reached my ears like echoes from a distant world. Part of me felt a quiet sadness for what was lost, but not regret. I had done what I needed to do to survive and protect my children from a toxic cycle of entitlement and blame. Lauren's attempts to garner sympathy in the family circle only deepened her isolation. Her victim narrative rang hollow against the backdrop of the truth I'd documented so meticulously. Some relatives reached out to me in whispers, offering quiet support and acknowledging the reality I had long lived. Those moments reminded me that truth, no matter how buried, finds its way to light. Now, when I think about that $9,000 necklace, the catalyst that exposed everything, it's a symbol not just of broken trust, but of the strength it took to break free. It represents the moment when I stopped being invisible, when I chose dignity over denial. The necklace is gone, but what I gained is priceless: autonomy, peace, and a family life defined by boundaries I set, not by sacrifices I made in silence. The road ahead is uncertain. Relationships remain fragile and mended only by mutual effort. But for the first time, I feel the power to shape my world on my terms. I've learned that respect must be earned, even within families, and that sometimes the hardest love is the love that says, "Enough." As I tuck Emily in at night, her small hand in mine, I whisper a promise to myself. I will protect this peace fiercely. I will guard the boundaries that preserve it, and I will never again lose myself trying to hold together a family that forgot how to hold me. The necklace may have vanished, but what remains is far stronger.